So, welcome everyone. It's good to have this connection today. But before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation and traditional owners of the country where we are meeting today. We pay our respects to elders and extend that respect to the First Nations, any First Nations people who are actually with us. Okay, so to get to the program itself, I might start by introducing myself as a way forward. I'm Margot Pearson. I'm currently the treasurer of the WILPF New South Wales branch, but I have actually been on the Australian board as well. So yes, it's very much, this is a WILPF event, I would say, and that would be obvious. Now, the program is going to be one where we're going to have two speakers. We're going to have, they're going to be obviously the conversation, and as well, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So what we're going to ask people to do is to put any questions they have on the chat as we go. And then when we come to the end, which will be at the for the 15 minutes at the end, well, it's more than that, 20 minutes rather, we will be able to go through some of those questions, hopefully that we will have time to look at everything that people have put up. I'd also like just to mention, given that I am a member of WILPF, so will be our speakers. I'm not sure whether everybody is very conversant with WILPF, but you might know that WILPF was actually established in the times of World War I, and it's been going ever since. It works for universal disarmament and peace around the globe. And this is a nice quote that I'm going to give you. WILPF is a feminist, non-aligned, anti-war and peace-building member-based organisation. So if you have any interest in that, you might like to come and find out more of this from another time. So that is going to be how it will work. I think the thing now that I need to do is to introduce our speakers so that we can have that. So both our speakers are members of WILPF, I think I've explained, and that what we're going to do, I'll introduce them first. One first is Barbara O'Dwyer. Barbara is, I think I can read out some of what she has been up to over the years. She has spent many years working in the Australian Government Aid Agency, AusAid, and now Department of Foreign Affairs, and working in the Pacific on humanitarian assistance and United Nations program, and finally as gender advisor. So she has also been very involved with WILPF and was for 8 years the actual president of the WILPF board for Australia as a whole. So the other activity that Barbara has been involved in is looking at a member of the steering group of Australian Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security, which organised and hosted the annual Civil Society Dialogue on Women, Peace and Security, bringing together government and civil society representatives to look at the implementation of national action plans. So as you can tell, Barbara has a really good understanding of what we're doing. The other speaker will be Dr. Ludmilla Kwitko, and Ludmilla has worked on women, peace and security and gender issues for many years, with donor governments, multilateral organisations and civil society as a practitioner. She is educator, I should add here, educator, policy analyst and researcher. Ludmilla is currently Associate Professor, an honorary position in the Gender Institute, which is the College of Asia and Pacific, Australian National University. So she is very much, again, someone with an extensive background in this, as well as being a member of WILPF itself in Canberra. So we have all of that. And actually, the other last thing I have to mention is, yes, she has, I've lost the plot there a bit, but Ludmilla, you have been involved, have you not, in the connection with the Asia Pacific region for WILPF and joined to that particular WILPF. Those of you who are not perhaps used to or know much about WILPF would not perhaps realise that we actually span the globe, so to speak, and consequently what's happened is that a few years back it was decided to break it into regions, which is how we have how we are really, we're part of the Asia Pacific establishment. So without more to do, and I will actually vacate the scene for our two presenters, and I really look forward to the conversation, and I think that it will be very, very helpful for us all to get some sort of fix on this work that is being done. It is actually about a set of issues to do with women, peace and security, much of which was followed the implementation of Resolution 1325 at the UN some years back. That was, I think it was the year 2000. So yes, but in fact, our speakers, I think, will be talking much more broadly than just that. That is to say, they will take the issues as they have evolved along the line for some years. So over to our conversationists.
Thanks, Margot. And thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation on women, peace and security, and to talk about the agenda more broadly. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and that I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge that these lands have never been ceded. I'd also like to pay particular acknowledgement to all the women human rights defenders, peace builders and civil society leaders in our and their diversity who are at the heart of the women, peace and security agenda, and to acknowledge that there can be no durable, sustainable peace without women's human rights defenders and peace builders in all our diversity. And that's part of what we really want to have a critical conversation about today. The purpose of our panel and our conversation is to look at what's been happening around the women, peace and security agenda for the last 20 years. After the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was brought into place. And where do we go from here with the women, peace and security agenda? How do we lead to a reframing of peace and security? And what are the critical questions we need to be asking about this? And more than asking questions, what are we actually going to do in terms of moving this to action? So Barb, why don't we start with you and just tell us a little bit about what is the women, peace and security agenda?
Yes, a very broad agenda. But basically it's an agenda that it's actually called the UN agenda on women, peace and security, and it's made up of 10 Security Council resolutions, which, as Margot mentioned in her introduction, the original one was the number 1325, and that was adopted in October 2000. And since then, there's been 9 other resolutions related to that in some way that now make up this overall agenda. 1325 has become like a we don't even say UN Security Council Resolution 1320. We just say 1325. It's become like not a mantra, but for women all across the world, they've adopted 1325 as their own. And so we all just refer to 1325. And when we say 1325, we all know we don't just mean that one resolution. We mean a whole range of things. Because the 1325, it was the first Security Council resolution that focused on women, in which the lobbying and drafting of the resolution was mostly the work not of civil society, not of government, and definitely the one where most of the actors involved were women. So it's very much a women's resolution. It's the only Security Council resolution that is regarded as having a constituency. So it's extremely important, and the whole agenda is extremely important to women right across the world.
Thanks, Barb. And you know, when we talk about the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we're also talking more broadly than just beyond the specific resolutions that came out of the Security Council and how they're implemented. We also talk about the gendered nature of instability and the role that women play in peace building. And in particular, this is an agenda that seeks to facilitate an inclusive approach to all aspects of conflict prevention, mitigation and resolution in ways that address the specific needs of the most marginalised groups, particularly women and girls, and that draws on the unique experiences to contribute to peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. So one of the things that we clearly know that underpins this agenda is the disproportionate impact that conflict has on women and girls and other gender identities. And contrary to popular belief, the agenda doesn't actually exclude men, but it recognises the impact of dominant masculinity and patriarchy in perpetuating the violence and oppression. And the movement and momentum for the agenda has come from and continues to sustain women and women's civil society organisations. So the purpose of the agenda is also to ensure diverse women can participate in all aspects of conflict prevention, of peace building, peacekeeping and post-conflict reconstruction. And I think it's really important to understand how 1325 actually came about, Barb, and what the role that WILPF had in the development of this Security Council resolution.
It's really interesting how it came about, and it's a relatively long story, but I guess
we're going to have the short version today, aren't we?
Yeah. But one of the, you know, the absolute origins, I suppose, came from the Beijing Platform for Action back in 1995, and one of the Women and Armed Conflict was one of the main categories that the Platform for Action covered, and the objective of that was to increase the participation of women in conflict resolution at decision-making levels and protect women living in situations of armed and other conflicts or under foreign occupation. So that set, you know, a base, if you like, for it. That was partly it partly was related to the fact that peacekeeping missions were becoming much more multidimensional, that they weren't just soldiers going in to keep the peace. They involved civilian staff as well, who were working on a whole range of things. So it became clear that there was so little involvement of women in any of these processes. There were hardly any women who were running UN missions. There were hardly any women involved in peace negotiations or peace agreements, and let alone the post-conflict reconstruction. So there were, I guess, an ongoing range of things things happening. UNIFEM, that's now UN Women, they had a big project called Women at the Peace Table. And then in the beginning of 2000, there was a big conference that was actually held in Namibia, which was, that resulted in a report called the gender mainstreaming in multidimensional peace operations. And that, because that was held in Namibia, and that produced a thing called the Vinderhoek Declaration. So Namibia happened to be on the Security Council at the time, and they in 2000 they were president. In October 2000 they were president of the Security Council. So they actually suggested to NGOs that they hold an ARIA session of the Security Council where NGOs could come and address them. And this was partly, the first suggestion for this actually came to our, WILPF has an office in New York. It's literally across the road from the UN building. And the Namibia came to the person who was our WILPF representative there, who happens to be Australian actually, and suggested this to her, you know, that they have this ARIA session. So this was sort of the beginning. That was early in the year. That was the beginning of the civil society NGO type involvement, and they set up an NGO working group, and it was really the NGO working group that did most of the drafting of the resolution, and it sort of grew. I mean, there was government support for it. The Canadians set up in New York. They set up a group called the Friends of 1325, and I know Australia belonged to that group. So, but it was a very informal group, and it was just there sort of, I suppose, for moral support. It was the civil society and women in particular who did all the work on it. So, and WILPF was very much at the centre of it.
Thanks, Barb.
So
maybe we can just highlight a couple of the main aspects of 1325 as we're going along. Yeah. Well,
I mean, the two fundamental aspects of it are about the impact of armed conflict on women, but the other and the really important one is, well, they're both important, but the more positive aspect is the participation of women in peace processes at all levels, at all decision, in all the ceasefires, the agreements, the post-conflict reconstruction, and the aim is to try and prevent conflict happening in the first place, but to try and prevent it reoccurring once the actual shooting is finished. And having women participate in those processes is, I mean, it's common sense, but it wasn't happening. But it's common sense to think that if you have all the people involved, like not just the combatants, not just the people who've been doing the fighting, but if you have everyone involved, then you get better agreement. Well, in fact, sometimes you don't get agreements at all, but if more women are involved, then you get agreements coming to fruition. And then you have all aspects of what needs to be done to prevent conflict reoccurring, and what happens in the reconstruction processes. If women are involved, then you just get a much better outcome. And it's, you know, you don't just have all those hard-nosed issues addressed like defence, economics, finance, governance, etc. You have all what, you know, are sometimes regarded as the soft issues, you know, health, education, disability, childcare, aged care, all those things that would not be regarded as something serious, if you like, in terms of peace agreements, but you get the whole spectrum addressed, and then you get a much better outcome.
Thanks, Barb. So we started to talk about the importance of having women involved in the peace process and integrated, included and integral to that process. But what do we actually mean by peace and security? And I wanted to give you an example of some of the work that WILPF Australia was involved in with the Women, Peace and Security Coalition in our discussions as part of the some of the discussions around the National Action Plan, actually trying to understand what it is that women from diverse backgrounds living in Australia and in our region actually understood in 2017. So I have to put that into this context. What did actually peace and security mean? And it was really interesting to hear the discussions on meanings of peace and security as we did them at roundtables across Australia. There were over 200 people who participated, and the participants' ideas that ranged from the personal, political, community, national, international, and there were 4 themes that emerged. The first was around the need to acknowledge the diversity of women's voices around peace and security. Women are not a siloed category. They are not a monolith. So the diversity of voices was critical. The second was around the respect for human rights and gender equality being key to the understanding of peace and security. The third was the marginalisation and women's voices. Discussions around peace and security within government and mainstream social civil society organisations and movements have failed to effectively listen and hear and acknowledge the needs, experiences and concerns of women from diverse backgrounds. And the fourth was around freedom. And this word is being bandied around so much as we make our way through COVID in our different parts of the world, certainly in Australia. In this case, in terms of understandings of peace and security, freedom meant humanising security, taking a human security approach, freedom from homelessness, from statelessness, sexual violence and harassment, all forms of discrimination and stigma, and freedom and opportunity to access justice, to make informed choices, speak and be heard, autonomy and control over one's body, and freedom of movement. And this was really important understanding to actually ask the members of our society of Australia and also some participants in the Pacific who we had an opportunity to speak with as well, to really understand what the broad range of ideas and activities and strategies were for promoting peace and security. And there was a kind of a dual focus that came out of those discussions. The first was the need to really build a domestic program that built around addressing inequality, particularly gender inequality, and that if we're going to have a peace-based foreign policy grounded in principles that ensured gender equality, promoting peace and stability, focusing on preventing conflict and reflective of our international human rights commitments. That's such a contrast with the evolution and the shaping of today's discussions of peace and security. So this was 2017. What we'd like to do, and what a number of us have started to discuss, is how can we follow through on this discussion of what does peace and security mean in 2021 in the situation that we have around the COVID situation globally and in Australia, but also what does it mean in terms of the reshaping and framing of the way that the issues around peace and security are being discussed in our country, particularly around the focus on increasing militarisation and securitisation, and with the fear that's being generated in this time of the pandemic, and also in terms of increasing changes related to climate change. What does peace and security mean now? Is, I think, something that we want to actually discuss further in our conclusion as well, don't we, Barb?
Mm.
So what needed to be done when we started to talk about implementing 1325 and the WPS agenda? Can you give us an idea of what some of the mechanisms were that were in place there?
Weren't a lot of mechanisms in place at that stage. I mean, I guess there were NGOs and other organisations who had been doing things that could be classified as women, peace and security over the years, but they weren't specifically classified at that stage. But one of the things that was done to implement 1325 was the development of national action plans. And this was one of the mechanisms that for governments. In 2002, the UN Secretary General produced a study on 1325, and then after that was completed, he then asked that all countries produce national action plans on women, peace and security, and that was that would have been in 2003. So about some countries did. About 11 countries completed national action plans at that time, and they were mainly European and Scandinavian countries. I think the UK was one of the very first ones, but Australia didn't. We didn't do it, and we took another 10 years to produce one. Some countries, like the UK, say, and the Scandinavian ones, Norway and Sweden, are already onto their 4th version, you know, because they did their first one so long ago, and those national action plans have sort of evolved over the years. But because
so, Barb, yeah, can we just have a brief overview of the Australian NAP, so we can give people a bit of a flavour of what did actually happen when the NAP came out in 2012, the first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security?
Of what we did to implement it, or
yeah, what does the first Australian National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security actually look like, or what did it have in it?
Yeah.
Just briefly, because we're running short time.
There were consultations beforehand. You know, WILPF was involved in we along with UNIFEM, as it was then, and ACFID, Australian Council for International Development, we put in a proposal that we would hold consultations each year and produce an annual produce an annual report card and hold dialogues with government on each year. There were consultations, some consultations with civil society. I mean, it was civil society that prompted the whole action to develop a national action plan. There wasn't, this really came from civil society. It didn't come from the government side. And none of us were ideally, we were far from ideally happy with the result. One of the things that was so crucial for the whole WPS agenda is the prevention of conflict. So the first national action plan that we did, I mean, it did cover some of that, but it was very, very focused on protection of women, not the participation. Well, it did have stuff on the participation of women, but it was all sort of women as victims rather than women as active participants and agents of their own life. So we formed, and this was basically came from WILPF, we formed the Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security, and that was made up of dozens of organisations who had an interest or who had some involvement in anything to do with conflict and women. And we held those and produced those reports every year. And at one stage, after considerable discussion with the Office for Women, by the way, were the ones who were the coordinators of this. The departments involved were Defence, DFAT, AusAid as it was then, and the Civil Military Centre and Attorney General's Department. And the Office for Women were the coordinators, overall coordinators. And they formed an interdepartmental working group, which later became the Interdepartmental Committee, and some of it, and we had representation on that committee, and then when the reviews were done, and there was a subcommittee formed, then there were 2 civil society representatives on that. There was mainly outward looking, internationally focused, but at least in that first one, there was the potential or the possibility for things to be supported within Australia. So it wasn't too bad, but it wasn't exactly what we wanted, and it's very hard from the outside to really influence a government publication policy.
Thanks, Barb. And I should add that Barb and I have both been very active participants as civil society representatives in terms of the National Action Plan. I'm sorry, can I just, Fergus, let you know that somebody called Halcyon Evans keeps talking over the top of us, just to let you know. So if that person could please mute themselves, that would be really helpful. And I just want to alert everybody who's on our webinar that what we've been doing as Barb and I have been talking is we've been putting links up into the chat, which show you the link to WILPF Australia, WILPF International, as well as the Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security, the National Action Plan, so that you get a picture of that there of the whole story around the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and you can actually go to those links and read some of those documents and the discussions there as well. Just to make a comment, the role of civil society has been really critical in terms of Australia's National Action Plan, the first one, which was from 2012 through to 2018/19, because it had a extension. And Barb and I were part of the civil society representation to both the Interdepartmental Committee, and then on the subcommittee that was doing a lot of the work around the implementation and the development of the second Australian NAP. So after a long 2 years between NAPs, and that could be taken in so many different meanings, Australia launched in April this year, 2021, the second Australian NAP, which is now going to go for 10 years, 2021 to 2031. And I should say they released it in April 2021 rather than launched it onto their website. And the focus of that is about the transformative potential of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, about placing women's meaningful participation at the centre of all our efforts, the government's efforts, to protect and promote women and girls' human rights, prevent and resolve conflict and establish enduring peace. It's now led by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and implementing agencies include DFAT, Defence, Home Affairs, Federal Police, and the Australian Civ Military Centre. It is totally focused externally, and it's aimed at increasing women's participation and leadership in the peace and security sector through 4 outcomes: supporting meaningful participation in peace processes, reducing sexual and gender-based violence, supporting resilience, crisis and security, law and justice efforts, and demonstrating the leadership and accountability for women, peace and security. I really encourage everybody to have a look at it, because it's on the surface quite a supportive in terms of its language for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. However, it raises many questions as the second National Action Plan, and the really basic question is, how will in fact it be implemented? Are the implementation plans that are going to come from each of the individual agencies going to be made public? And how will we know that these plans work together and are actually in a process of meeting the outcomes that have been set for the second National Action Plan? The other critical questions that need to be asked, and we can go into this in some more detail in the discussion later, is how is this plan going to respond as a 10-year plan to the geopolitics and the changing global dynamics, when we're having some interesting responses already to global dynamics literally shifting in front of us in relation to both the pandemic, climate change, and increasing militarization. And I'll just add one more question, although in my notes I have a list of about 15 questions, that is, how do we actually reconcile what the conflicting policies that we have in terms of the women, peace and security agenda? And that's the policies that we have that sit around the implementation agencies like Defence, like Foreign Affairs and Trade, like the police, and like Home Affairs. Where does this leave us in terms of actually understanding how the policies are going to operate as we increase militarisation and securitisation in Australia, as we look at different ways to implement our climate change policies, as we look at our refugee and asylum seeker policies as well? How do we reconcile this with the women, peace and security agenda and the understandings of peace and security that women in Australia have been expressing? I think that that's a really critical issue. Margot, can I just get a check-in time as to how much more time we have?
Say 10 more minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I want to raise that as an area for possible discussion and also consideration for all of us who are supportive of the peace and security agenda in Australia, and also who are supportive of the women, peace and security movements and need to consider what this means. So women, peace and security is not just a matter for women, and it's not a women and stir matter either. So it's not enough to add a woman to the peace table or to a panel discussion. We actually, and women are not a monolithic group. Women in their diversity across all their intersecting diversities, whether it be age, race, religion, ethnicity, culture, ability, bring many different perspectives to the table. And in this wonderful study that I was talking to you about earlier about what women in Australia understand as peace and security, in those roundtable discussions, people highlighted that it's not only a women's agenda, it's actually an agenda about peace and security with broader implications for sustainable development. And this is where I just wanted to link quickly to the Sustainable Development Goals and the National Women, Peace and Security agenda more broadly. We haven't talked about this much in many of the panels that I've been sitting in on during this week in Raising Peace. But the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 5 and Goal 6, are around determining how we're going to foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies which are free from fear and violence. And there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development, and no sustainable development without gender equality. So I would like to get us to think about what that actually means and how we look at what it is that Australia and individual countries are involved in terms of thinking about not just a national action plan on women, peace and security, but how have we integrated the women, peace and security agenda into our the way that development occurs in Australia and in other nation states. I'm going to move now to sort of begin some part of the wrap up, Barb, and we had asked ourselves a question there towards the end about, does the women, peace and security agenda and do national action plans only apply to countries undergoing conflict? What would you say?
No, definitely not. I mean, that's the perception that sorry, that they do only apply to countries in conflict, but it applies to the development and implementation of domestic as well as foreign policies, and how they intersect to ensure national security in all its meaning. Violence isn't just armed conflict. Violence is a spectrum from personal, community, national and international. So policies certainly on violence against women, but on refugees, on human rights in general, on social welfare, all go to contribute to what is security in any country. And of course, you know, obviously that's going to be a bigger job in countries that are or have been undergoing conflict, but it applies just as much in Australia or any other developed country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where we need to really be thinking critically about how we make that connection with the domestic and the international, how we make it within our Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, but how we make it also more broadly within the geopolitics that exists within our own and in our own society and in our own country. And I have to say that as we prepare for the 2021 annual open debate on women, peace and security, which will happen before the anniversary of 1325 on October the 30th, on the thousands of women, human rights defenders, peace builders, advocates for gender equality and other civil society leaders who play critical roles in advancing our common goal of peace, human rights and gender justice are under targeted abuse, prevented from exercising their rights, and in conflict zones across Afghanistan, Myanmar, Colombia, Yemen, South Sudan, Palestine, Tigray, Ethiopia, and so many others. I hate to read that list out loud and think about what that means in terms of individuals' life. And I also want to comment that as the past 20 years have demonstrated, in many ways, the Women, Peace and Security agenda has become a major policy cornerstone in international policy circles, and certainly in terms of the work that's come out of the UN Security Councils. But also it's demonstrated that words are not enough to produce commitments, significant, meaningful commitments to peace and gender equality, nor do they guarantee accelerated action towards achieving a gender-just world. In fact, in some cases, it's become a bit more of a rhetorical exercise that remains in the high-level corridors and chambers of the UN without positive impact on the lived experiences of diverse women and girls and other marginalised populations around the world. So that despite the many national action plans and the frameworks that we have to advance gender equality, the 10 Women, Peace and Security resolutions and the countless commitments of member states, we still live in a world with a rampant armed conflict and instability where women are disproportionately impacted, whether before, during or after armed conflict. And in a world of COVID and increasing militarization. So this raises some fairly critical issues for us in terms of how do we move forward here. The common jargon that serves can serve at a time as a facade of concern for many states, but the real critical issue is the lack of implementation, the lack of resources behind women, peace and security, and the lack of genuine conviction that goes beyond rhetoric. And most of the critical issues around human rights, disarmament, conflict prevention, and the roots causes are pushed to the back blocks, including in the Security Council, where there's last year when the resolution for COVID issues were being pushed forward around the COVID pandemic, it took the Security Council weeks to address the situation because the council members fought over disputed language to be used in the ceasefire resolution at the expense of millions of women and girls disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, especially in terms of humanitarian settings. There's an inconvenient truth here, and that inconvenient truth echoes loud across the globe and in Australia. The inconvenient truth is that the high-level debates and the discussions in the council chambers, it's the devastating impact of creeping militarism and military expenditure, including the actions and the policies of the Security Council members, which are having the significant impact on the progress we're making or not making in terms of women, peace and security. So what's the challenge for us in Australia? And this sort of gets us to the last part of our conversation here, is how do we step up and make the move beyond rhetoric? How do we move beyond policy by media announcement and fear to move to the serious action required for conflict prevention, for peace and security? And how do we move beyond simply recognising the roles of women as peace builders, adding women and stirring, and acknowledging that they have a seat at the peace treaty table, and move to a genuine, authentic decision-making process around peace and security, and redesign that table rather than just sit at that old table, and reframe our practices of peace and security? That's the question for all of us. Barb, where do we start?
Get a new table.
And what does it actually look like if we try to do that?
Well, yes, good question. Preferably one where we literally a round table where everyone can have a say. But I think, you know, just you mentioned the WILPF UN Security Council's 1325, a 20 years report, didn't you?
Yes.
There's just a quote from that, which I think for me says it all. As feminist activists and organisations have demonstrated through their call to action for a more equitable and demilitarised world, prevention must prioritise investing in systems and economies of care, not arms and military systems that only exacerbate global insecurity. So that's the quote. So in other words, we need to delegitimise war as a cultural practice. And Australia needs to develop and implement policies and practices that emphasise peace building over militarism. Current Australian government policies and practices, both domestic and foreign, lean towards increasing militaristic approaches to dealing with perceived threats, you know, because in fact they must all only be perceived because we don't actually have direct threats. You know, as you mentioned, there's, you know, increased military expenditure. We've got armaments manufacturing on the increase, and now the purchase of the nuclear powered submarines, which certainly don't contribute to our security, but to our insecurity. So we should have policies and practices that contribute to a calm, safe and secure world, and not to fear and anxiety. And how we get women's voices heard in that has to be through a whole range of processes. And you know, there's no one simple answer to that, because it has to be done at a local level. I mean, you know, there's elections coming up next year. There's a lot of kitchen table conversations going on amongst groups who have particular interests like climate change, aged care. You know, there's just a huge range. So right down at that level, people have to be talking about what they think the priorities are and what needs to be done. And then it has to be done in more formal ways through consultations. I mean, there is just so little consultations with the public, and so little opportunity for people to really have access to the politicians, especially, you know, to people in high level like the ministers and things. I don't have I don't have a particular answer to this because it involves so many things, but basically it's a matter of education so that people do know what's going on, and our report on militarisation, the normalisation of militarisation, is a good start for people to use to see what the overall attitude is towards what security is, and trying to get women's voices heard when it's something like how do we infiltrate our voices into all these terrible discussions between the tension between China and the US and now Australia. I mean, how do we do that? That's something that requires huge effort on all our parts.
And I think
a lot of hard work involved.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to, thanks, Barb. I think that's a great place to then turn and ask more involvement from the rest of the people and who are listening in today. Thanks to Margot for facilitating the next section. Thanks, Margot.
Okay, but you stay there because you're going to answer the questions. Okay, so have we got any questions coming forward? You've obviously wiped them out. No. What have we got? Yes.
I like this one. Make peace building competitive, and one day hopefully countries will fight over who is best at peace building. That's brilliant.
That's very good. Yes, I must say one of your points about the difference between, you know, at what different levels people are talking. I was at one of the sessions that you had down in Canberra about the previous event, and previous thing was the person that was in the group that I was in. We were in breakup groups. I noticed that I would mention the word security, and he instantly started, because he was a military person, started talking about security in the military sense. And so I said to him, well, there's another way of looking at security. And so I asked the other people in the group, how were they as women, because they were younger women, how did they feel about going out and alone at night? How secure did they feel? Well, without fail, all of them made it clear that no, they didn't feel secure. And it was a very useful contrast, because the army guy, for the first time, I think, realized security can mean different things to different people. So, yeah, it really made a difference to the discussion that followed. Yes.
Thanks, Margot. I think that that's a really important point, and I think that's one of the reasons that in our discussions, and certainly all the activism and advocacy that and I'm speaking of the Women, Peace and Security Coalition, as well as WILPF, did in light of the second National Action Plan, was to reinforce that message about the need for a connection between the domestic situation and the international situation, as reflected, if you're going to reflect that in a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. And I particularly in this case want to highlight to people the discussions that we've just had, the national consultations we've just had around the National Action Plan for Violence Against Women at the Safety Summit, and the need to recognise the issues around sexual and gender-based violence in our own society. That, if you look at outcome number 2 in the new second National Action Plan, is the outcome there is to an expectation that this National Action Plan will contribute to reducing sexual and gender-based violence, increasing girls' safety and security, and increasing access to justice, and reducing harmful gender norms. The question is how? How do we make that connection in terms of the work that we're going to do nominally internationally through the National Action Plan? But how do we not make that connection to our domestic situation? Such a critical nexus that needs to be made.
That's right, indeed. So do any of our participants, would they like to bring forward some ideas to think about how we can make this move forward? That is the action plan, because there is a problem. I think that once it's been put on the website and so forth, I don't think there seems to be much, what would you say? I think that the problem is that it just is likely to lie fallow, you might say, unless we manage to push it along. So yeah, that's really a problem.
Margot, there's one question which is partly relevant to that, but it, I think deserves an answer, and it's about women in the military. And one of the and she asked, you know, was that there's sort of conflicting ideas about, you know, should women have the right to fight, or does their being in the military just legitimize an institution that, what should I say, an institution that is antithetic to the goals of feminism. And I think, you know, this is, I mean, to me, this is one of the issues with both the previous National Action Plan and the current one, is that there was a lot of emphasis on getting women into the military, getting more women as peacekeepers, more women in the, you know, in peacekeeping missions, etc. More women in, not just in the peacekeeping missions, but in the field, like in Afghanistan, you know, oh yes, if we've got women out there, they can talk to other women, etc. But in fact, a lot of that is really just about intelligence gathering for the military. So this emphasis, I mean, that if we're going to make a National Action Plan move, we need to make sure that we're moving it in the right direction. And I certainly don't want to have more women in the military. I mean, in WILPF, we've always said we want less men in the military, not more women in the military.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, we're not saying, you know, we're not so unrealistic as to say there shouldn't be a military, but the way, you know, like people have to sort out what they think is the sorts of things that are supportive of women, and how they can take and what sort of things should happen under a National Action Plan that really do advance the equality of women, not making women more like men, but actually having them recognised as having a particular roles, if you like, or the sorts of things that women do on the whole, we want recognised as being equally as important as all the things that men do. And a national action plans should be you know, should be based on that, not just on the most superficial things.
Well, perhaps we're getting very close to the end. Did someone speak up?
Can I just highlight one thing, which I think was, which is really important, and that's while we focus on the women, peace and security commitments there, I think there's a set of double standards that's often emerging as well in terms of structure and policy. And it's a sort of a bit of a, I hate to use the term, but I can't think of another one, a two-faced approach. On the one hand, we look at the importance of women, peace and security commitments, while on the same hand, we're spending tens and hundreds of billions of dollars on militaries, on producing, exporting arms, on resisting ratifying arms control treaties, and we're taking contradictory actions on denuclearization. So it's like we're using Security Council Resolution 3025 in a framework that's utilised to make war and conflict safe for women, rather than actually moving to the prevention and the ending of war and conflict, which is the underlying and key goal of 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda.
Yeah,
thank you.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, we have 1 minute to go. I think I'm right. And I think we don't have lots of questions, but we do have, you may notice that we have actually been able to give you a whole range of places where you can find more information, and a lot of that is going to be sitting there with link identification as well, so that it will be easier for you to do. I think I'm right in saying, Fergus, you may have a question on this, is that we are recording all these sessions, and so it will be possible for this kind of information that we're getting from this to get that to everyone. So I would like to conclude by thanking our speakers. I think they've given us a really good look at the whole business of giving action plans and the whole problem too of the militarization, which intersects unhelpfully between the two. And I think that's really important. So I think that probably what we all need to do now is to think about how we will be able to make sure that the latest National Action Plan actually goes somewhere. So I think that will be the sort of message I would like to give, is we all need to get in there and make sure it happens. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody on the who attended the session.
Yeah.
Thanks, Barb.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, everyone. That was good. Lots of work for everyone to do.
That's the way.